Good morning.
Good morning.
Atheists, agnostics, skeptics, you are all welcome here at Seattle Atheist Church. We call ourselves atheists because you will never hear anything supernatural preached from the pulpit. So the way that we work here is this is a church based on scientific naturalism and secular ethics. And members of the church are all welcome and invited to give a sermon on the topic of their choice, as long as it's atheist. So if you're interested, if you have an idea for giving a sermon, please contact myself or Jack or Stephen. And this morning, Stephen is going to talk, and the title of his talk is Moral Naturalism, or Why You Shouldn't Torture Puppies. Yes.
All right, well, thank you everyone for coming. So I want to start by saying that this is a theory of morality that I find very appealing. This is by no means an official position of the church or anything like this. This is just something that I find that, I find appealing. I want to describe it in broad outlines today, mainly to get the outlines out there and see where the points of disagreement are, where the points of clarification need to be made. So what I'm going to be talking about today is something called moral naturalism. And broadly speaking, moral naturalism is a belief that moral statements are statements about the natural world. And just like other statements about the natural world, they can be true or false. They can be objectively true or false. And they can also, you can use as standard tools of science to investigate whether these moral facts are true or false. I'm contrasting it, again, we're looking at this from a very high level, but I'm contrasting this with moral relativism, where that's the belief that, moral statements you can't say whether they're true or false. I'm also contrasting moral naturalism with divine command theory. And according to that theory, it has to be, the gods who tell you whether or not something's moral or not moral. And then finally, moral naturalism is normally contrasted with moral rationalism, Kant's theory, right? That you can know just through the process of pure reason whether or not a moral statement is true or false, that morality works like geometry. So those are the theories that I don't find appealing, and moral naturalism is a theory that I do find appealing. So another way of saying this is moral naturalism is a belief that there's nothing spooky about moral facts. They are just like other statements that we make. If you say that, for example, you should not torture puppies, that's no different in kind than the statement, you shouldn't drive with bald tires. It's the same type of statements. Both statements can be true or false, and additional investigation might change your mind about whether or not they're true or false, and you should be able to rely on the normal tools of science to decide whether or not those statements are true or false. I'm going to, in this sermon, I'm going to focus on a very particular type of moral naturalism. This is sometimes called evolutionary ethics. And this is, should be familiar from some of the previous sermons we've talked about. This is a theory that parts of it were advanced all the way back in David Hume's A Treatise of Human Nature. That's back from 1738. And of course, we've talked about Darwin's moral beliefs in the descent of man, so it has its roots in Hume and Darwin. But more recently, there's like a whole industry of books on this. It's become, to some extent, the sort of accepted scientific theory of morality. There's been a whole industry of books by philosophers, psychologists, neuroeconomists. For example, E.O. Wilson with his sociobiology and the social conquest of Earth. Patricia Churchland in Brain Trust. She's a philosopher who's defended moral naturalism. Sam Harris in The Moral Landscape, and Christopher Bohm in Moral Origin. So those are just some examples. There are tons of people who are defending some sort of variant of this theory of moral naturalism. So during this sermon, I'm just going to sketch out in very broad terms what this theory of moral naturalism looks like. I'm really going to make three claims. I'm going to advance three claims and claim that those are sort of the central principles of what moral naturalism are. So those three claims, just to lay them out there up front. Claim number one, morality should be explained with the same theory used to explain other physical and mental traits in humans and other animals. Broadly speaking, our general theory for explaining any mental and physical trait at all is a theory of evolution by natural selection, right? And so moral traits are no different from any other mental or physical traits. That was Darwin's argument in The Descent of Man. Claim number two, morality should be considered to be a branch of psychology. That's all it is. It is a branch of psychology like, any other study of, like fear or anger or any of the other things that drive people to do what they do. Morality should be understood in naturalistic terms to refer to facts about human psychology. And then finally, the statement that moral should statements should be analyzed just like any other should statements. As I said before, really there's no difference in saying you should not torture puppies and you shouldn't drive with bald tires. It's the same, you should be analyzed in the same way. All right, so let's start with the first statement, the statement that morality should be explained and it's just part of the theory of natural selection. Darwin already has it covered, right? So we have this grand theory of evolution by natural selection that this has been incredibly successful, right? We've applied it to so many traits of human and animals. And so, as we talked about before, Darwin expends a lot of energy in The Descent of Man and the expression of emotions in man and animals, and is showing that same theory can apply to mental traits, but also, importantly, to moral traits. So that was one of Darwin's primary goals from the beginning, was to use his theory of natural selection, not just to explain how animals in general evolve their physical traits. He wanted to use it also to explain how we got the particular mental and moral traits that we have. So that was part of the original theory. People have been very resistant to the idea of using natural selection to explain morality. And I'm going to argue that the main reason they have this resistance is because they have an oversimplified theory of human psychology. That the reason that people don't like to think of using Darwin to explain morality is they think that in the state of nature, people are really, really bad. That everyone is selfish, people would grab all the cookies off a plate of cookies if given the chance in a state of nature, that it's like the game Survivor, right, on television, that everyone's out for themselves and no one would want to live in that type of world. That's the picture that we've got drawn for how people are naturally, that people are selfish monsters who will take advantage of every situation that they find themselves in. But this is a overly simplistic view of human psychology, and we have a lot of evidence to explain now, non-selfish behavior, which we'll talk about some experiments that have been done to show that people are inherently, non-selfish. But the general mechanisms we have things like kin selection, multi-level selection, reciprocal altruism. We have a number of different mechanisms that have been explored to explain how people can develop non-selfish behaviors and develop pro-social behaviors that will actually are designed to, make people want to help other people in their tribe or do things that aren't directly to their own self-interest. Darwin, again, always believed this, right? He believed strongly in the importance of kin selection. He thought kin selection was the basis of morality. In particular, he wrote, any animal whatever endowed with well-marked social instincts, the parental and filial affections being here included, would inevitably acquire a moral sense or conscience, as soon as its intellectual powers had become as well or nearly as well developed as in man. So Darwin believed that the basis of morality could be found in the love of the parent for a child or love for family members that naturally extended from there, that's where our moral emotions originally developed and then it turned into a moral conscience. Darwin also believed in group selection. He believed in multi-level selectionism. He writes, when two tribes of primeval man living in the same country came into competition, if, other things being equal, the one tribe included a great number of courageous, sympathetic, and faithful members who were always ready to warn each other of danger, to aid and defend each other. this tribe would succeed better and conquer the other. So if you had two competing tribes, if one tribe had a bunch of courageous people, they would win in the state of nature. So, and there's no reason to think that, natural selection, Darwin didn't believe natural selection meant that everyone was inherently selfish. And we have plenty of contemporary evidence, which I'll go over in a bit, to show that actually people aren't selfish, that the natural behavior of people is not selfish behavior. All right, so that's statement number one. Statement number one is morality should just be considered part of Darwin's general theory of natural selection. It's just, we already have an explanation for it. It's how we explain every other human trait. So let's move on to statement number two. Morality should be considered to be a branch of psychology. So we've also spent a lot of time in previous sermons talking about innate emotions, things like fear, sadness, anger, and disgust. The claim here is that people also have innate social emotions, moral emotions, things like fairness, empathy, pride, shame, and guilt, and these are part of our human mental apparatus in the same way as we have a built-in, sense of love for our children or fear of snakes or, all of the innate emotions that we have. Just to summarize, Paul Ekman has shown that all cultures share the same basic emotional expressions. Those are cultural universals. For originally discussed 5 universal expressions. And we talked about the neuroscientist Jaak Panksepp's research into effective neuroscience, where he's demonstrated that animals as diverse as rats, chimps, and humans all have laughter, for example. They all share a way to laugh. Rats laugh in the same way as humans laugh. One of the problems that you run into as soon as you start talking about emotions is once you get beyond the really basic ones, like anger and sadness, everything's a mess, right? People disagree. Even Panksepp and Ekman disagree. Once you get, past like the 5 really basic ones, you get disagreement there. So one of the problems with the claim, the general claim around moral naturalism, is we don't have a very well developed theory of psychology. It's not a very mature science yet, and so it's very hard because we're working with, we have experiments around some of the things that we're going to be talking about, but I'm very cautious about using terminology from psychology because, very quickly people get into disagreements about the difference between jealousy and envy or about the difference between shame and guilt, and I think that's just because we don't have a very developed theory there. Okay, so, but that's not to say, I believe, of course, emotions exist, and I believe that they're super important for understanding human morality, but I also just don't believe we have a very good, grasp of what those emotions are yet. I'm also going to assume that, following Hume, that emotions are fundamental to human psychology. Like Hume, I believe that reason alone can never be a motive to any action of the will, and that reason is the slave of the passions. And so the idea there is if you really want to understand, what drives humans, you have to understand what those emotions are. So there's no avoiding the fact that to understand morality, you're going to have to understand what the basic human emotions are. But, again, it's not clear what those things are. So what I'm going to rely on is I'm going to rely on the basic theory of emotions that Jaak Panksepp sets out in his textbook on effective neuroscience. And just, again, to remind you, here's how he describes how fear works. Here's how he describes how a basic emotion like fear works. According to his theory, something like a rat has an innate fear of the smell of a cat, for example. They're just born with a fear of the smell of a cat. It's very easy to reproduce that fear in a laboratory. You just bring in, a piece of cloth that's been around a cat. You set next to a rat, and they start showing a bunch of fear behavior. So that's innate. That's not something that they learn. A rat has a fear of open spaces. They inherently have that. Makes sense, right? You don't want swooping birds coming and eating you. So that's another just kind of built-in innate fear that a rat has. So it's interesting that we have 2 words that we're referring to the same thing here, or 2 different causes. So it's not clear whether are those 2 different emotions the rat is feeling. I don't know. Whether the fear of a rat from the smell of a cat is different from the fear of a bird. Don't know. But the basic idea is, so there's some sort of primal mechanism, built-in mechanism that causes the emotions that we have. And then what Panksepp argues is, what we do is through the process of association, we generalize that fear out so it applies to more and more situations. So in the case of the rat, after the rat learns to be afraid of the smell of a cat, then the rat starts to associate not only the smell of a cat, but the actual cat itself, right? That strange thing walking around with whiskers. The rat learns to start being afraid of, an actual cat instead of just the smell of a cat. So by generalizing out and by analogy, we take something like fear and apply it to broader and broader situations. So, our cognitive abilities are being put into use to be able to generalize our emotions into wider and wider, areas. So that's not only for things like fear, it also could be things for like sadness and happiness. And it's really a matter of identifying, well, what are those original causes of fear, original causes of the different emotions, and then how they get generalized out. Okay, so the idea here is that fear gives us a model. At least we're trying to understand the social emotions. So if we wanted to understand, I don't know, what a social emotion like empathy or a social emotion like fairness, that we should try to understand what the sort of basic cause of that emotion was, and then talk about how it got generalized out more generally to cover other things. So how fairness started out and how fairness got applied to a broader and broader situations. So let's talk about fairness. So one of the claims I want to make is that fairness is, we have an innate sense of fairness. That's just something like fear that we're born with, that we have through natural selection. It's just one of those things that people want to be fair, that people want to be fair. And the reason that I believe this to be true is we talk about Frans de Waal's research on different types of monkeys and chimpanzees and bonobos, where he did the experiment. Remember the one with the grape and the cucumber? They have the two monkeys next to each other in the cages. If you give one monkey, a grape over and over again for performing a task, and then you give the other monkey a cucumber, the monkey will get very, very angry and throw the cucumber back at the experimenter because presumably, it's unfair. And this experiment has been replicated, with bonobos and with chimpanzees, to demonstrate that really, that sense of fairness is built in. We've also talked quite a bit about the Ultimatum Game. That's a game that economists have used over and over again. That's a game, just to remind you, where the first player gets $10. They're allowed to give whatever amount to the second player. And if the second player rejects whatever money is given to the second player, then neither of them get any money at all. If you are the second player and you are offered $1, what should you do? Should you take the dollar or should you reject it? John?
Well, I think if you had multiple turns.
Oh, one turn. Yeah, good question. Just one time.
So
Nice.
you won one turn.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess you should maybe reject it.
You were rejected,
because
or you
then
one
the
turn?
other person would know not to mess with you.
Oh yeah. Well, see, that's good thinking. Good answer. So, so we're assuming a one-time thing, and that's a standard objection that's brought up. I'm glad you brought that up. What they've done in their experiments is they've shown that the rational thing to do in that situation, if you knew it was a one-time game, is to take the dollar, right? Because something's better than nothing. But internally, we just have this, innate sense that that's not fair. I mean, I just get $1. I mean, what are you talking about? And so when they've done this experiment, actually most people end up originally offering a 50-50 split. And if the split goes down below 30 cents, most people will reject it at that point. So that's something that's been replicated in different cultures, with different groups of people, religious and non-religious groups. So it seems to be, again, a cultural universal. It's also something that they've Frans de Waal duplicated this in chimpanzees and bonobos. So he set up a slightly more elaborate version of the Ultimatum Game, but he was able to show that this also holds not only for humans, but also for bonobos and chimpanzees. Okay, so we have this innate sense of fear, and innate sense of fairness, and this is intuitive, right? I mean, one of the reasons that people are so attracted to things like religion is this belief that, well, okay, maybe things aren't going well now, but once everyone dies, all the scales will be balanced. There'll be justice throughout the world. Just wait a little longer, and all the balanced book will be evened out. And it's also, of course, an important motivator of how we watch movies and read books, the bad guy has to die in the end. We actually feel bad in the movie if the bad guy doesn't die. It kind of ruins the movie. I mean, most movies. There's some exceptions, the usual suspects and things like that. But in general, Darth Vader better die at the end of the movie, because otherwise it wouldn't be fair and we wouldn't be satisfied in some ways. So we have this innate sense of fairness, or at least I would argue. And I would argue that the innate sense of fairness is really no different in kind than our innate sense of fear of large looming objects or loud sounds. That is just something about human nature. The other built-in moral emotion that's gotten a lot of attention going all the way back to Hume is what Hume called sympathy and what we would call empathy today. That humans have a built-in sense of empathy, which drives a lot of our decisions. This is my favorite Hume quote, so I'm going to go ahead and throw out my favorite Hume quote. "Let us suppose such a person, ever so selfish, let private interest have engrossed ever so much his attention, yet in instances where that is not concerned, he must unavoidably feel some propensity to the good of mankind and make it an object of choice, if everything else being equal." Here's the best part of the quote. Here it comes. "Would any man who is walking along tread as willingly on another's gouty toes, whom he has no quarrel with, as on the hard flint and pavement?" So I love that quote. So if you're walking along, would you go out of your way to go stomp on someone who has gouty toes? And Hume is saying, no, given the choice, your preference is to avoid causing pains to others. And he would claim that comes because we have an innate sense of sympathy, which for Hume drives a lot of his account of morality. So again, the idea of empathy is a built-in thing. Interesting thing, contemporary research has shown that even rats have an innate sense of empathy. There was an experiment published in Science called Empathy and Prosocial Behavior in Rats. This is kind of cool, because what they did in the experiment is they set up this cage where one of the rats was in a trap, right? And then they introduced another rat, and the rat had the choice between eating some chocolate or saving this other rat from being trapped in the cage. And rats consistently will help the other rat escape before they'll start munching down on the chocolate. And this is supposed to show that rats intrinsically have a sense of sympathy in the same way as humans. Here's what the researchers write. "The presence of empathy in non-human animals is gaining support in the scientific community, although skeptics remain. In the current study, the free rat was not simply empathetically sensitive to another rat's distress, but acted intentionally to liberate a trapped conspecific. The ability to understand and actively respond to the affective state of a conspecific is crucial for an animal's successful navigation in the social arena and ultimately benefits group survival." So the people who did this study are making an argument for group selection, and that's why the rat has an innate, it will help out even a non-related rat in a situation where the rat is trapped. Okay, so that's emotion number 2. Candidate for morality, I would say empathy is a driver of human morality. And then the final candidate is this constellation of things that would include pride and shame that we usually describe in terms of praise and blame, right? So there's some related constellation of pride, shame, guilt, and praise and blame. They're all related to together. So according to Darwin said that the uniquely human emotion, or the uniquely human expression of emotion, was blushing. He wrote, "Blushing is the most peculiar and most human of all expressions." He wrote that in The Expressions of Emotions in Man and Animals. And, the interesting thing about blushing is it's one of the few emotions that, like sadness, anger, fear, and laughter, it has some sort of outward manifestation, right? I mean, when you laugh, you make that weird sound coming out of your mouth. When you cry, water actually comes out. When you blush, your face actually turns red. So there's good, that's good evidence that there's something innate about that emotion of blushing, because it has such a strong physical effect, and it doesn't seem to be culturally relative. So we crave praise and blame. When we're praised, then we feel pride. When we are blamed, then we feel guilt. There's actually a group of, this is an odd group, but there's a group of, they call themselves experimental philosophers, who have been, it's kind of a weird, but anyway, they call themselves experimental philosophers because what they've been doing is they've been doing, actually going out and doing experiments on people to figure out when they actually say that they blame people. So they've been trying to figure out what the ordinary language use of words like blame are. And they have some, pretty complex results. It's better in some ways than, I looked through, Gabriella Taylor wrote a book called Pride, Shame, and Guilt, where she spends, a lot of pages analyzing our ordinary language understanding of pride and shame. And it's interesting to actually see how, psychological evidence is brought in to try to see what we actually mean when we say, when we talk about shame and guilt. Darwin, of course, he also paid attention to praise and blame. He wrote, "But another and much more powerful stimulus to the development of the social virtues is afforded by the praise and blame of our fellow man. To the instinct of sympathy, as we've already seen, it is primarily due, and that we habitually bestow such praise and blame on others, whilst we love the former and dread the latter when applied to ourselves." So here Darwin is, he actually cites Hume earlier in this passage. Like Hume, he believes that somehow this is also rooted in the emotion of empathy in one way or another, the emotions of pride and guilt. So those are the three, and I'm by no means am I making the claim that those are the only sort of innate social emotions, and those might not even be the right one. The general claim is that humans, just as a preference, have certain emotions that they have that drive them to do the actions that they do, and this is something that's been bestowed on us through natural selection. And so those are sort of the candidate ones: fairness, empathy, and also praise and blame, pride, guilt. All right, so the final statement that I made at the beginning of the sermon was that moral should statements should be analyzed just like any other should statements, that you should interpret them in the same way. This claim is that there's really no difference between saying you should not drive with bald tires and the claim that you shouldn't torture puppies. That's the same, that you should analyze in the same way. And in both cases, what you're doing is you have a constellation of beliefs and desires. In the case of you shouldn't drive with bald tires, you're making the assumption that the person doesn't want to die a horrible death while driving down the freeway, and so that fear is one of the things driving them to make decisions. And you also have certain beliefs that bald tires, could lead to that fear. So I'm making the assumption there that it's really your emotions that are driving your decisions. Now, you could convince me that it's okay to drive with bald tires, right? And there's two ways to convince me that statement's false. You can, on the one hand, convince me that living a thrilling life is actually worth it. That's part of the thrill of life, driving with bald tires. You could die at any moment, but that's so exciting that you should do it. You should always drive with bald tires. So you can convince me that, no, actually, you know what? You should drive with bald tires. Or you could also convince me to drive with bald tires if you explain to me, actually, when the tires are bald, they're closer to the ground, so they have more traction. And so, I'm not saying it's true. I'm saying that you can convince me. No one, please.
That's why people take up drifting as a hobby.
Drifting, there you go. They're ignoring it. So this advice does no good at all to people doing drifting. So there's way you can either question what is the motive for doing it, or you can question the beliefs behind that motive. But this is a statement that can be true or false, and you can argue me out of believing that you shouldn't drive with bald tires. Another interesting thing about that statement, you shouldn't drive with bald tires, is it's not really that I'm saying I have this desire not to drive with bald tires. And you're not really saying you should have the desire not to drive with bald tires. You're just saying, in general, as a rule of thumb, people shouldn't, if you share the same emotions I do, if fear of death and things like that, the same constellation of beliefs, it really doesn't make sense to drive with bald tires. And that's what I mean when I say don't drive with bald tires. And I would say that not torturing puppies is the same idea, right? But the motivating emotion there is this empathy with puppies, that puppies are nice and you don't want to torture those poor puppies. But you could convince me that statement is false if you, for example, showed me convincing evidence that Martians had descended on the Earth and replaced every puppy with a wind-up toy. Then I might say, oh, I don't care about torturing those puppies anymore, because they're not actually like me anymore. I don't feel any empathy for the puppies. They probably don't feel pain. They're just little wind-up toys, and yeah, go ahead, torture the puppies. That would take some convincing, or you can come up with another argument that actually, puppies, have super strength, so they don't feel it at all. which, please don't believe that. None of that's true. But you could make arguments about, first off, about my beliefs about about puppies to change my attitude about moral statements. Okay. All right. Finally, I want to talk a little bit, as Darwin actually talks about moral naturalism versus another theory that's often lumped into moral naturalism, utilitarianism. And Darwin actually does spend some time talking about conflicts with utilitarianism. And what I would claim is moral naturalism, or at least the evolutionary psychology approach to moral naturalism that I've been talking about, actually solves some prominent puzzles in utilitarian. The standard counterexamples don't apply when you talk about evolutionary ethics. So first problem, familiar trolley problem. Everyone familiar with the trolley problem? So if you're not familiar with I'll give you the simpler variant. This is by Judith Jarvis Thompson. She used to be a professor of mine a long time ago. But this one's a little simpler, and I think it expresses the same idea. Let's say that you walk into a hospital. You're pretty healthy, but there's 5 patients in the hospital. One needs a new lung, one needs a new heart, one needs a new kidney, a new spleen, a brain. Let's do that. Then we got all 5. The brain thing won't work. Oh, well, forget the brain one. But there's 5 organs that are needed by the patient. You're wandering in, you're completely healthy, maybe just paying your medical bill, and they say, great! And they take you, they carve out all your organs, and they save 5 lives. Now, strictly speaking, from a utilitarian's perspective, that makes sense, right? I mean, you're creating the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. You sacrifice one for the benefit of many. Spock keeps going on about that in those, Star Trek movies. So sure, yeah, why don't we carve up the guy? Now, that doesn't, that's kind of bad. People, usually say, I'm not, I like the idea of utilitarianism, but that seems a little extreme, right? I mean, it doesn't fit, how I want to live in the world. And I think our reaction to that is clearly what's causing us not to say, hey, I can't wait to rush to the hospital and be carved up into 5 different organs, is, we're driven by an emotion of fear here, right? We don't want to go into hospital as if we might be carved up. And the other part of that is, there's this oversimplification of our emotions in utilitarianism, where they try to understand, now, again, I'm painting with a broad brush here, but where they want to understand everything in terms of happiness, where everything's being driven by the simple emotion of happiness, and being able to break it down into other emotions, in some cases, emotions that aren't even pro-social emotions, things like, self-preservation and fear. That's really what we're feeling in this situation, right? We don't want to walk into a hospital and be faced with the possibility of someone carving us up into bits. And I think that the real objection to this example, both the trolley problem and to the transplant problem, is that it's not psychologically real. That we judge these situations using all of our psychological mechanisms. We consider not only things like, trying to help, empathy in this case, trying to help these dying patients, because I feel bad for the guy who needs a heart, but on the other hand, I also don't want people carving me up. So I'm going to weigh those 2 desires and come out with a decision that's, responsible. Okay, so that's one standard objection. The other objection to utilitarianism is, I'll just shorthand it by calling it the give all your money to Africa issue. And Peter Singer, of course, is famous for describing this one. Peter Singer describes a scenario, okay, you're walking down the street and you see a child drowning, right? The child's drowning there, but you've just bought some expensive new shoes. And the child's drowning, should you walk into the pond and save the child? I mean, even if you were to ruin your expensive new shoes, how many people would save the child? You did it. But, good, okay. All right, great, because, it would be wrong, right? If just concerns for your fancy new shoes, not to save the drowning child. Most people agree with that, but then this is where Peter Singer gets, nasty on you. Quote, by donating a relatively small amount of money, you could save a child's life. Maybe it takes more than the amount needed to buy a pair of shoes, but we all spend money on things we don't really need, whether on drinks, meals out, clothing, movies, concerts, vacations, new cars, or house renovation. Is it possible that by choosing to spend your money on such things rather than contributing to an aid agency, you are leaving a child to die? A child you could have saved? Shame on all of you. Shame on you for killing all those children last time you went to see a movie or bought a latte at Starbucks. Bad, bad, bad. So What he points out, actually, this is from the first chapter of the book, The Life You Can Save. Peter Singer's the Princeton philosopher. He also points out in the book that in the United States, 97% of people classified as poor by the Census Bureau own a color TV. And so that's the definition of being poor in the United States. You contrast that with the 1.4 billion people who are poor by an absolute standard. And by that, he means they're not getting their basic human needs met. Things like they're hungry part of the year. It's not that they have to watch in black and white instead of color. It's that they're actually hungry for at least part of a year. This is from my perspective, the idea that you should be giving everything away seems unbalanced, right? There seems something unbalanced about it. Maybe I'm just being a little selfish, but I want to occasionally go off and see a movie or spend money on other things other than helping the poor. But from a utilitarian perspective, the idea is that you should be giving all of your extra income, everything that you have, because that's the right thing to do. From the point of view of a moral naturalist, though, or at least someone who follows this evolutionary ethics point of view, is you have to balance these different emotions. That you can have, selfish desires that you have to balance against your intrinsic need or intrinsic want to help other people. So it's a matter of balancing those things. All right, so I just want to finish off by talking about what it means by what this means for being a good person. What I think the conclusion here is, from the point of view of a moral naturalist, people are driven by all sorts of different emotions. And they're not all selfish emotions. A fireman actually does rush into a burning fire, not because he hopes to get some happiness or pleasure out of that immediate moment. He does it because he thinks it's the right thing to do. And that's just part of, what humans are. And I believe that, moral emotions aren't the only emotions that drive us, and they shouldn't be the only emotions that drive us. We have obligations to family members, we have selfish desires, and we have to balance those things out. And I think that that's, completely responsible. And that really being a good person, in the sense of trying to balance those different emotions, is what it means to lead a happy life. And so let me stop here, and we can discuss.